Yeah, it's a bit strange having to speak on this subject, because for years, people who opposed socialism and opposed Marxism used to deride us for talking about international capitalism. They said we spoke in cliches, they said we didn't talk about the real world. Today, 90% of these people have adopted the new in-word, globalisation, and they said that globalisation proves that Marxism is out of date. What I'm really going to argue today is that international capitalism is there. International capitalism is as powerful as ever and as dangerous as ever. But the idea that there's something completely new called globalization is a myth used to obscure and bewilder people, not to translate it. What is the myth? The myth really is that somehow something incredibly has happened to capitalism over the last 5 or 10 years, which means that suddenly states, political parties, trade unions are incapable of fighting back against what capitalism does. Not merely will we sometimes lose, which has always been the case, but the very possibility of fighting back is impossible. This is the message that Tony Blair and Gordon Brown put across at a conference they organized 2 years ago on global economic change. They argued that globalization meant that the old promises of governments that they could intervene in the economy to create full employment was no longer true. They didn't argue that, of course, it wasn't government intervention in the economy which created full employment in the past, but armaments. No, they argued that somehow governments had been able to pass, but this thing, globalization, made it impossible. It's an argument spelt out by a man I debated with here a year ago, Professor Meghnad Desai of the LSE, who says that global movements of capital mean the state is incapable of exercising much control over the economy. It's not only, however, from the Labour Party types you hear this argument. James Goldsmith, former dinner tables partner, to have a dine on friendly terms with the leadership of the National Front, currently sponsor of the right wing of the Conservative Party, said in an interview in Tribune, and clearly Tribune thought this is impressive what he said, the left Labour magazine Tribune, he said, something created unemployment. It was not high technology, which is the usual excuse. What you have is the mass movement of management offshore, of manufacturing offshore. Transnational corporations today are few in number, but move at great speed to wherever labour is cheapest. The conclusion, governments can't do anything, trade unions can't do anything, these people are all powerful, they can move at will, what do we do about it? And it's an argument also, goes back many, many years on the left. It's some 12 years ago, I think, I debated at Marxism with Nigel Harris, who used to be editor of International Socialism Journal, and he essentially accepts the same argument. Capitalism has changed, there's a new stage of capitalism, capitalism doesn't depend upon the state is powerless, capital can move from wherever it likes, anywhere in the world, and what are we to do about it? The danger of the argument is that it seems an incredible argument. If people accept the argument in that form, it has enormous dangers, because it translates down into every shop floor, into every trade union branch, into a pessimism which says essentially there's nothing we can do. All we can do is tighten our belts, tighter than the Koreans or the Taiwanese or the people in Southeast China or the people in Latin America or perhaps eventually the people in Rwanda or Ethiopia. We have to put up with living standards lower than theirs in order to maintain any jobs or any possibility. It's an argument which in third world countries, it's used by government after government. It's being used by the new government in South Africa. Because of the power of the multinationals, we cannot do anything to protect you against the living standards. You have to compete. To compete, you have to sacrifice, and so on and so forth. The state is powerless, trade unions are powerless, workers are powerless. Now, what I really want to argue today is, really, I'm tempted to say the king has no clothes. No, the king exists, the king is powerful, the king is called international capitalism, but the idea that he's put a whole new set of clothes, maybe he's donned a dirty singlet or a ragged pair of underpants, but the rest of its fine raiment is nothing new. It's something very old we understand from the past. Let's go through the arguments of globalization. Really, there are 5 linked arguments. Capitalism is more international than in the past. He says there's more international trade, more international finance, more international production. Secondly, the argument is the multinationals more important than in the past. Thirdly, the argument becomes the multinationals can force states to obey their will so that states don't matter anymore. The fourth argument is multinationals are so powerful They can move their capital anywhere they want, a drop of a hat. The phrase used is they're footloose. And this explains growing unemployment in the advanced industrial countries. The fifth argument is that multinationals are less and less tied to particular countries, they're less and less connected with nationality, and this means we're looking towards a situation in which we're going to have a new international capitalist class, no longer British capital, French capital, or American capital, just one international capitalist class. And the byproduct of that is, although the situation for jobs may be insecure, somehow the world become more peaceful. Something which Nigel Harris argues in one of his books. He said, because we have an international capitalist class, we're moving into an era where there'll be fewer and fewer wars, less and less conflict between states, because basically the capitalists won't want the states to fight. I want to argue this. The argument starts with things which are true. Not all the truths it refers to are new truths, but then it moves on into areas in which it vastly inflates and exaggerates what's happening to create a picture which doesn't at all correspond to the reality of capitalism today. Let's start with the first point. Capitalism is more international, growing more international. There's a little book published in 1848 called The Communist Manifesto, in which describes the internationalism of capitalism. And I've not read any of the writers on globalization who's described it better, writing in 1996. The need for constantly expanding markets chased the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe. It must nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, establish connections everywhere. The bourgeoisie has, through its exploitation of the world market, given a cosmopolitan character of production and consumption in every country. All old national established industries are destroyed, or daily being destroyed. They are dislodged by new industries, and so on and so forth. Marx and Engels described capitalism. They said that capitalism, by its very character, grows off, starts in certain bases, grows up and spreads, and envelops the world and transforms the whole world. And the reality is, if you look at the 60 years after Marx and Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, you see a fantastic growth of capitalism, fantastic growth of capitalist trade. It grew sevenfold between 1848 and 1914. Growth of trade, growth of investment, growth of international production. And indeed, if you look at the rate of growth of international trade, people go on how fast international trade and international investment is growing today. In the period of the 1880s and the 1890s and 1900s, it grew at the same speed as today. In the interim, what's interesting, there was a period between 1914 and basically 1940, between the wars, in which the crisis of capitalism led to a very, very enormous drop in the growth of trade. The growth of world trade hardly grew between 1914 and 1940. And in this period also, because British capitalism was in decline and British capitalism sold off its investments, the growth of capital investment overseas stagnated in that period. But if you look 1848 to 1914, 1945 to 1996, essentially two periods very, very similar, with acceleration in of growth of investment and trade in the 1950s and 1960s, then the level of trade growing not nearly as fast as the 1980s as it did in the 1950s and 1960s, a growth of investment in the 1980s, then trading off beginning in the 1990s with the recession, but that's the overall pattern. The trend towards internationalization is there, but if you look at the figures, it's very difficult to see where the qualitative change takes place. If you talk in terms of trade, you talk in terms of finance. To be honest, finance, people go on about how free finance is today, how people can move money at a touch of a button from one country to another. Before 1914, the whole world was on the gold standard. There were no restrictions on the movement of money. The idea of the movement of money is some new feature of the system is not. Let's move on. Where there has, alongside the change in trade and change in investment and trade in finance, there has been a cumulative change taking place in capitalism throughout this period. This is the transformation in the organization of production. When Marx and Engels wrote, most production took place in small firms, a characteristic firm employing 500 or 1,000 at most employees, in a city like Oldham, a center of the textile industry, scores of firms competing with each other. The transformation takes place from local production to regional markets, to national markets, to world markets. It had already taken place when Marx and Engels wrote. The actual organization of production was still very much small local firms. By the beginning of the 20th century, the organization of production was increasingly large firms with 4 or 5 firms dominating the industry in each particular country. It's at this stage you get the formation of the mergers, formation of what, if you read Lenin's books, imperialism, which sometimes confuses people. What is a trust and what is a cartel? Because they hardly exist these days. the linking together of firms into things called trusts, the formation of the first big giant firms, they all come together, for instance, in Britain and Holland, of various firms involved in the extraction of oil in third world countries, production of margarine and things like that into Unilever, the coming together of chemical firms into ICI, the formation of the first big motor companies and so on and so forth. You get a growth of production, which already by 1914, production was beginning to take place, go beyond national markets. When we analyse the reasons for the First World War, one reason is the demands of the Russian, of the German and French coal and steel industry, each had demanded a bigger space to expand than they had within their national boundaries. Already you have the expansion beyond national boundaries. And of course, once you have the resumption of the great boom in capitalism after 1945, the tendency of capitalism to expand beyond national boundaries takes place. And therefore, you do have the last 20, 30 years, the growth towards some internationalization of production. If you want to say what's new in the picture, the growth of international trade is not new. The growth of international finance is not new. The growth of international production is new to some extent. It's a continuation of the past, it's a new thing. And therefore, for the first, we do begin to talk today about international trade. And so, for instance, an analysis of the 40th biggest firms in the world, carried out by the American magazine Fortune, decides what the biggest firms are, shows that 40% of the biggest firms do more than half their sales in foreign markets. But it's quite interesting when you look at the figures. You see, we have to be very careful when we say firms, there's a tendency towards internationalization of production to assume it's achieved. I remember writing an article on the car industry about 15 years ago, how Ford was aiming to produce the world car. And the world car was going to be called the Rabbit. But then actually, when they actually came to produce the car, they produced two different cars. One for the American market, which I think is still called the Rabbit. The other for the European market, which is called the Fiesta. They never succeeded in producing the world car. They had the ambition of producing the world car. They never succeeded it. The growth tendency towards the internationalization of production, we shouldn't equate trends with something that's already achieved. And so, for instance, you find that although managers talk about the internationalization of production, and firms continually talk about on and on and on, we must move towards the internationalization of production, you find interesting figures. You find that of the 1,400 largest 100 firms who do more than half their sales abroad, only 18 maintain the majority of their assets abroad. That is, at the present, 82% of the world's biggest firms keep most of their assets, most of their manufacturing equipment in a particular country. Even if the country is a small country. You know, the countries which are most international, the firms which are most internationalized are ones based upon small countries. Sweden is a small country, therefore Saab and Volvo have to look towards internationalization. Holland is a small country, therefore, not surprisingly, Unilever and Royal Dutch Shell are international corporations. But even if you include those cases, 82% of the largest firms, most of their assets are in one particular country. Again, a 1990 inquiry among top managers of the 200 largest European firms asked them how they intended to organize production over the next 5 years. 93% said that they intended to organize their entire production within Europe. To by 80%, sorry, I've got this wrong. Sorry, the managers of the top 200 firms, they intended to organize 93% of their entire production in Europe, to buy 80% of their inputs from European sources, and to sell 83% of their output to European sources. That is, 4/5 of their production was going to be in Europe, not in Taiwan, not in Korea, not in Brazil, as all the mythologists of globalization would say, but in Europe, by which they meant essentially the common market area, plus Sweden, at the time, plus Sweden, plus Switzerland, plus Norway. 80% of their production in Europe, 80% of the things they bought, their inputs they used for production in Europe, 80% of their sales in Europe. That is, the picture of globalization covers up the reality of what's actually happening on the ground. Again, even when you talk about the growth of multinationals are more important than the past. But we shouldn't assume that multinationals are a new thing. You know, you ask someone, who was the biggest car producer in Britain in 1913? It's a 4-letter word, which doesn't spell Austin Morris. It doesn't spell Humber. It doesn't spell any of those other archaic. Ford was the biggest car producer in Britain in 1914. Who's the biggest drink producer in Germany in 1940? The double-barreled name, Coca-Cola, which when the war broke out, changed its name in Germany to Fanta, and then after the war ended, then took over Fanta and ran it as the Coca-Cola operation once again. The old story is well known about ITT. No, actually, General Motors bombed its own factories in Germany during the Second World War, then claimed compensation of the American government when the war was over. Those factories in Germany actually were producing war materials for Germany. General Motors continued indirectly to own those factories and then got control of them. That is the multinationals. Now, what is truth are increasingly important. More and more production takes place through multinationals. More and more production takes place across international boundaries, but we shouldn't imagine the things, nor we should imagine that the whole development is in one direction. You see, I was brought up with the reality of the Seven Sisters, the seven great international oil companies. I'll tell you something, the seven international oil companies are less powerful now than, not the oil industry, the oil companies are less powerful now than 40 years ago. Why? Because you have the establishment of an Italian oil company, a French oil company, very third world oil companies, all of whom operate across national borders, but don't operate in the same global way that the Seven Sisters did. Therefore, you have contradictory. All I want to get across, if we're not talking about a single process, which is irreversible, moving in one direction, you talk about contradiction in the process. Let's move on to the argument. Multinationals can force the government to do whatever they want them to. Now, here, this is true, and it's not true. It's true in the sense that international capitalism has always been powerful against particular national governments. Back in 1931, old Labour, Ramsay MacDonald, tried pathetically to put up resistance to the international capitalism. International capitalism demanded that he cut the dole in Britain by 10%. Ramsay MacDonald only wanted to cut 5%. Ramsay MacDonald crumbled in the face of international capitalism, cut the dole by 10%. The trade unions didn't know how to fight back. The rest of the Labour Party didn't go fight back. The dole was cut by 10%. That is, the Labour government in 1931 was brought down by international capitalism. Big component of which actually was British capitalism. It's brought down by capitalism. 1974, Labour governments came to power committed to reforms, very small reforms in the interests of workers. Those reforms were crushed by the power of international capitalism. Again, very important component of British capitalism, not just foreign capitalism. The idea that the power of international capitalism is new is a myth designed to cover, in the case of the Labour Party leaders today, their surrender in advance to the force of international capitalism before they've actually gone into office. Now, and having said that, you also have to say, in the modern world, there are cases where for particular national states, when their national capitalist classes want to put up resistance to multinational capitalism, but sustained resistance. South Africa, there's no doubt, if you look at South Africa, from 1976 onwards at least, but if not earlier, from the Soweto revolt, the big international capitalism in South Africa wanted to begin to dismantle apartheid. The local capitalists and the National Party which ran South Africa maintained the apartheid structure for another, 14, 15 years in the face of sanctions, pressure, all sorts of things, because if the national capitalist state wants to put up resistance, it can put up resistance. Iraq, despite the horror of the sanctions and everything, Iraq sustains itself today in the face of everything. Why? The Iraqi capitalist class is more or less united around Saddam Hussein. Saddam Hussein is powerful, he's got a nasty army. Defiance is possible. When we hear the state can never put up resistance, what people are actually saying is, let's surrender in advance to multinational capitalism because actually we want to sacrifice workers' living standards for capitalism in general. Indeed, if you look at the reality of how capitalism operates today, it's not a case of multinational capitalism comes along and tells the state to do something. All the time there's negotiation, bargaining, and so on and so forth between the state and between different multinational capitalisms. There's a book which none of the people who talk about globalisation ever refer to, a book by two academics called Stopford and Strange, which goes through how actually a trade deal is organised. How does trade take place? How does investment take place in particular countries? And again they say, the multinationals come along and say this, the local bourgeoisie represented at state comes along and says this, there's a bargaining, there's argument, there's disputes. And if you look through the Financial Times any day, you'll see it. There's a row last week. Indonesia wants to set up its car firm. And so unimportant is the state in Indonesia today that one son of Suharto wants to set up one car firm, Another son of Suharto wants to set up another car firm. The multinationals that has already established themselves in Indonesia don't like it. There's bargaining taking place. It's not just that multinational capitalism comes along as a pushover. There's always this bargaining, negotiation between the local states and multinational capitalism. The people who say it's a pushover, it can sound, you sound very radical. Multinational capitalism is so powerful, it can beat everything. But the conclusion is, then there's nothing anyone can ever do. The conclusion doesn't actually correspond to what actually capitalist governments do on the ground, let alone what would happen were we to have a workers' government anywhere in the world. Let's move on. Capitalists are free to move their capital anywhere in the world. This is the big one, the big argument about globalisation, which underlies everything else. And it's pooey. Let's start. Of course, you can move money at a drop of a hat, particularly if you've got a compliant government, like the government we're going to have under Tony Blair in Britain. It's compliant. You can press a switch. I can, these days they don't even search you for money when you come into the country. They search you for drugs. So I could, hypothetically, when I came back from speaking in Chicago a few weeks back, I could have come back with £1 million in a suitcase. It's hypothetical, or it depends upon having a suitcase. It also depends on having the £1 million. But, so finance is easy to move. Goods are fairly easy to move. You have to have transport, you have to have ships or trucks and so on and so forth. Goods are easy to move. But the idea that you can move whole factories and whole production processes, people aren't considering two things. The first thing is factories take a long time to build. No, it's not true that Hitachi, is it not Hitachi, it's one of the Lucky Star, is it? It's going to build a factory in South Wales. It's not true that they just go, and suddenly a microchip and colour television factory emerges in Newport. They say they're going to build a factory in Newport. It will take them 3 or 4 years, probably, to build the factory. Maybe 2.5, maybe 3 or 4 years. But that's not the end of it. Building a factory is not the end of it. Then they have to establish communication links between the factory and the outside world. They have to establish networks. They have to make sure they've got people on the ground who are going to sell the bloody things. The people who are going to service it. They have to distribute to all the television shops in Britain details of, wiring diagrams and so on and so forth. They have to component manufacture. Then they have to make sure they've got the components. They have to make sure, a simple thing, if you're going to produce microchips, you need absolutely pure water supplied to your site. You don't want mucky water, you need pure water. You need to make sure you've got a constant electricity supply at a constant voltage. You have to make sure that you've got, you're going to get the silicon supplies, everything. And of course, when you're talking just-in-time production, one production team needs lean production. Having these things organised in advance, having them on the ground, having them ready is incredibly important. In that situation, it's not true. At the drop of a hat, you can say, oh, I've had enough of South Wales, I'll go and do it in Singapore. Well, Singapore's good in Singapore. Singapore probably does have the constant voltage, all the things. You can't do it in Bangalore in India, where the power is off on average 8 hours a day, despite the fact it's called the Silicon Valley of India. You can't just move from place to place. You can't just get re-established distribution. The reality is, modern industries don't stand alone. Any industry depends on a complex of industries around it, inputs and outputs, organisation around it. And therefore, the time of building the factory, they come together, and it means there's limits to how we can move. Put it crudely. Rupert Murdoch could move the production of his newspaper titles from Fleet Street to Wapping, a distance of 1.5 miles. He couldn't have moved it to the border of Warsaw. You think it through. How do you produce daily newspapers in Warsaw for distribution in London? How do you get the newsprint from Scandinavia to Warsaw? You have to work out some method of doing that. How do you make sure the computer lines are reliable and so on and so forth? All this takes time and energy and so on and so forth. Now, of course, eventually things speed up, technological process, some of these things speed up and so on and so forth. When we talk about capitalism, is it today? In the 1990s, not it maybe in 50 or 60 years' time, productive capital is much more immobile than financial capital. When firms move, and they do move to smash unions, the moving usually takes years of planning, meticulous. Murdoch worked for years to move from Fleet Street to Wapping. If it wanted to move thousands of miles, it would have taken even longer, even more planning, even more coordination, and so on and so forth. And therefore, it's worth the result is when you come back, you find that far from this picture, I say, sales are more and more international. The growth of finance is nearly as international today as it was in 1914. When you actually talk to productive capital, it's interesting. The picture is much, much more concentrated in particular countries, particular regions of the globe, and so forth. Again, I was repeat some figures, but it's worth repeating it because there's so much mythology that figures themselves puncture. That for American multinationals, 64% of manufacturing sales and 75% of service sales are to the home market. The American market matters to American manufacturing. It's not true that Ford can say, you know, forget America, we've got the rest of the world. For Japanese multinationals, when people think of Japanese multinationals these days being more multinational, more international than American, 75% of manufacturing and 77% of services, the sales are in Japan itself, not international. And the assets, the concentration is similar. 70% of American multinationals' assets are in the United States. 97% of Japanese multinationals' assets are in Japan. And Britain, it should be said, is the exception, not the rule. For Britain, only 39% of manufacturing assets and 61% of service assets are in Britain. But Britain's the exception, not the rule. And even then, if you say, where is the biggest single concentration, by far the biggest single concentration of the assets of British manufacturing firms is in Britain. The idea that the British state, not run by flabby Blairites, that a British worker state would be powerless to take over anything because it just move abroad instantaneously is nonsense. The idea that workers can't do anything. If you've got 40% of a firm's assets, which you could interrupt and stop with production, you've got power over that firm. The reality is, let's go back to the case of Wapping. Wapping didn't fail because of multinationalism. Murdoch was into multinationalism, multinational production, the sky, the satellites, the whole lot at the time of Wapping. Wapping failed, but the key to the Murdoch's empire, the whole structure came down to the £1 million, was £1 million a day or £1 million a week he was earning in his London operation of printing newspapers. Wapping failed because the newspaper print unions failed to move quickly enough, decisively enough, and militantly enough to stop the transfer from Fleet Street to Wapping. That is, the multinationals have power, but they don't lose their national base. If they don't lose their national base, a state which really wanted to take them on can confront them. A working class which can take them on confront them 10 times over. Now, let's move on a bit more. That's the question, then, the argument about jobs, both from people on the left and from people on the right, like Goldsmith. Buchanan in the United States used the same argument. Jobs are going because of third world imports and third world production. It's interesting. When you look at the figures, there's a big debate among academic economists about exact statisticians about the figures. But let's start with the figures. The growth of there has been a growth to advanced industrial countries of imports of manufactured goods from non-advanced countries in recent years. Do you know what the growth was? It's from 1% of imports to 2% of imports between 1982 and 1992. That is a small growth of imports, not a huge growth. You find that, so for instance, in the European Union, 88% of imports into the European Union come from other European Union countries. That's excluding goods produced inside each individual country. So most of the imports into Germany come from Britain or Denmark or Holland or Italy. Most of the imports into Italy come from Germany or Britain or Holland. Most of the imports into Britain come from other European countries. So, you know, if it's 12% of total imports into Europe come from less developed countries, you can hardly explain the huge loss of jobs, the 8, 10, 20% unemployment you have across Europe in terms of imports from other countries. And what is more, when you actually say unemployment, it's interesting. You'd think if unemployment is caused by imports, you'd think all the unemployment would be concentrated among manufacturing workers, not among dustmen. You can't import, you can't import a dustbin service. You can't even import a postal delivery service, despite the pretense of the government that somehow they can deregulate and somehow Dutch postmen are going to be dropping off post in Britain. And yet you find among unskilled workers, the destruction of jobs takes place at the same level in manufacturing industry, in service industry, in distribution, and so forth. What's to explain it? If you want to explain unemployment, you have to explain the drive to rationalisation, increased production, speed up, plus new technology, not imports from other countries. Globalisation is an excuse for employers who want to sack workers. And indeed, even The Economist, a man called Adrian Wood, who argues most to the impact of third world production on jobs in advanced countries, actually says the impact is like this. He says competition to third world means that employers in the West put in new technology, increase production, faster working, and this destroys jobs. It's increased pressure on workers that destroys the jobs. It's not the direct input of jobs. I'll put it another way. If you want to see if you want to go out visibly and see the imports, for instance, from China in Britain, they're concentrated in shops on every high street. The 99p shops and the £1 shops. They're all Chinese goods. Now, to be honest, I hate to disillusion people, but the things you buy in the £1 shops are not the centre of manufacturing trade. You know, it may be a bit tough on the British lavatory brush manufacturers. The fact that you can buy a very good Chinese lavatory brush for £1, and you pay £2.99 for a British one. But the reality is, this is not what has caused the huge hemorrhage of jobs right across Europe in recent years. The final thing, this idea that multinationals are not tied to the national state, and we're witnessing a new non-national capitalism, which is going to be peaceful, and so on and so forth. The reality is, if you go through analysis of multinationals, this has been done in a very difficult to read but very important book by two people called Ruth Grock and Van Tolder. It's a very academic book, and it's full of academic jargon, but the figures are incredible. They show, for instance, that the key things which multinationals do take place in what the authors refer to as their home bases. Research and development invariably takes place in the home base of the multinational. So even in the small countries, Sweden and Holland, Sweden, Holland and Switzerland, 2/3 of Swiss firms and 75% of the 20th Sweden manufacturers concentrate their research and development in their home country. In Scandinavia, you went through this weird performance. You had right-wing government denationalised all the banks. You then had the banks going bust. The banks owned 40% of the assets of Swedish industry. 3 years ago, the state intervened to protect Swedish industry by renationalising the banks and then trying to sell them off. But the state played a role. The state didn't just sit back and say, we believe in globalisation, we believe in free markets, let Swedish industry go to the bust. You know, Wallenberg, who's controlled Swedish industry for the last 60 or 70 years, he doesn't matter, it doesn't matter if he goes bust. They intervened. You look further, you then find, alongside the firms which have been saved by direct government intervention, there are a whole range of firms which depend upon past patterns of colonialism and therefore the influence which governments exert elsewhere in the world for the survival. They go through the list. Royal Dutch Shell, BP, Unilever, Elf Aquitaine, Akatel Aslan, Total, ICI, British Aerospace, Petrofina, BTR. All these firms are firms which depend upon the pressure of one government upon another for their thing. There was analysis carried through British Aerospace after it had been privatised. And the analysis, I don't know if it's independent or the Financial Times, said the myth that this is a firm outside the public sector, when 2/3, nearly all its sales in Britain depend upon the public sector, and most of the sales elsewhere in the world, as for instance Saudi Arabia, depend upon the British state doing deals with other states. The state is absolutely central to these core firms. Then you go on. The oil industry. We all know how important the state is for protecting the fortunes of the oil industry. You have to remember that 18 of the 100 world's top 100 firms are directly or indirectly involved in the oil industry. The idea that the state doesn't matter, the state doesn't play any role, the people who run these things don't care which state they're in and whether the state has armed forces to intervene on their side or not, is absolute rubbish. Finally, I could go on and on. The American computer industry wouldn't exist but for the orders of the Pentagon. The American aerospace industry wouldn't exist for orders of the Pentagon. Japan wants to build an aerospace industry. The Japanese Ministry of Defense is absolutely central to that. The old arguments about the British, French, and German aero industry, the question of the new European fighter, that's the future of British aerospace and I can't remember what the German firm's called, and the two firms which are currently being merged by the French government over the objections of their owners in France under Chirac. Mitterrand was quite happy to see the second biggest aerospace firm in France privately owned. Chirac is threatening to nationalise the firm unless it merges with the big nationalised firm. Why? Because the state is absolutely central in this sense to things. Oh, good. Oh, yeah, I've got and the reason is because the mythology, the reality, when you go through, and again, facts are difficult things when you're confronted with a king with no clothes or with few clothes.
The reality is the idea that the boards of directors of the great national companies have no nationality. That's an amazing analysis. Of the 30 biggest American firms, only 5 had a single foreigner on their executive boards. They're American born and bred. And only 2% of the board members of big American companies were foreigners. I think that's probably hardly higher than the number of blacks on American top executive boards these days. Only 2 of the biggest 20 Japanese companies had a foreigner on their board. Only 15 biggest German firms, only 4 had a single foreigner on their management board. And the interesting case of that Volkswagen, who put an American on their management board and then accused him of industrial espionage the moment he'd put him on. Now you say, why is this? And then you find that of the biggest firms, very few have more than 10% of their shares owned overseas. Why? Because capital doesn't just consist of money which can move from country to country. It consists of assets, of huge productive assets, which have to be located in one part of the world or another. If you're located in that part of the world, you depend upon infrastructure, you depend upon firms that supply you, you depend upon being able to exert pressure on other terms so that they supply you even when they get better off from the firm down the road. You want security of supplies, you want security of markets. You need to control physically, have influence physically over the people around you. The reality is firms don't exist in isolation, they exist as complexes of firms. If you exist as a complex of firm, having something in common with the people who own the firms next to you is quite important. Having a state over which you exercise leverage is important. Which means that actually the growth of international capitalism exists, growing spread of finance, growing spread of trade, and so on and so forth. But the idea that the capitalists can just sit back and say, we have no nationality, we're not interested in the state, is nonsense. On the other side of that, the idea that the state had no power whatsoever. The power of the state to control international capitalism was always limited. But the idea that the power has gone completely, and the idea that if somehow people who claim to be left-wing get in control of the state and then say, we have no power, we have to bow to the multinationals, is an excuse. It's not an analysis of what the reality is. And I could go and say this, what is the real pattern of the world? The real pattern of the world is of giant multinationals, each based on particular states, each attempting to pressurize other states which have groups of multinationals in trying to get investment from elsewhere, bargaining, pushing, jostling with each other, each of them trying to establish areas of the world over which they have control. So it's quite interesting. If you break down where investment goes to from particular advanced capitalist states, it tends to congregate from each state in particular parts of the world over which they want to exercise dominance. The Americans want to exercise dominance over Mexico. The French exercise dominance over much of what used to be French-ruled Africa. The British have traditional areas of domination. You have a pattern, not of free-floating capital, but of vast capitals tied to states which have the most advanced weaponry, the most advanced armies, and you never hear the capitalists complaining about the scale of the armies or the level of military technology or the ability to destroy whole chunks of the world, bargaining, pushing, jostling with each other in the most violent fashion. And from this, there follows a final point. You know, and I would hate to come back to Nigel Harris, because he's someone I like to think of as sort of a acquaintance or a friend, I've known for years, but when people like Nigel Harris come up and say, multinational capital, this new world system is one in which there can be peace, it's going to be much more violent, much more nasty than in the past. Bukharin said in 1916, he said, internationalization of production takes place, but the organization of production within national boundaries. Today, internationalization of production still takes place, but to be honest, most of the organization of production, perhaps a bit less than in Bukharin's time, within national boundaries. If that takes place, the clashes between capitalists also take the form of clashes between states. A lot of the time, negotiations over trade, they talk about free trade, and then you find, after 2 years after the signing of GATT represents a new era of free trade and so forth, you still have the Americans and the Japanese haggling over this, over microchips, the Americans and Europeans haggling over agricultural exports. You have haggling, negotiation. You have each of them, you have the British and the French and the Americans sponsoring rival groups in Africa, as in Rwanda. You have rival tendencies, rival pressures, and then you have you have the situation in Yugoslavia, which the Europeans and the Americans followed opposed strategies. That's the reality of the world, not a peaceful world, not a world in which the state has disappeared, but in which world claiming the state has no power is used by people who want to take over the state in order to attack workers' living conditions, which we have to say, actually, the state state were controlled, or a worker state have power, short of that, workers' trade unions. The more integrated capitalism is internationally, the more work power, strangely enough, the more power works in one particular part of the system can have an effect in that.
I know the buzzword is globalization, but when you look at the world around today, large parts of the world, you wonder if the right word is globalization or balkanization. Because what we've been seeing is that whole areas have been breaking up with the creation of new national states, which are competing viciously to set up their own independent patch in this international world capitalism. And this is something that we have to look at very clearly when we confront these myths of globalization. No ruling class can launch itself into the prospect of conquering the world market without having a very firm launching pad, no matter how small. And this is the reason why we see this situation where, to take the example of the Balkans, the breakup of Yugoslavia, you have vicious wars going on where each section of the ruling class is trying to make sure that they really have their own launching pad so they can go ahead. Now, in Greece, we are part of the Balkans, and we also have our own exponents of the myths of globalization. You know, the government in Greece is a social democratic government, and it is dominated by right-wing Blairites. And what they say is, all right, these things are happening, but they are relics of the past, really. The trend is towards overcoming. It's the underdevelopment of the Balkans that is creating these phenomena. The future lies with globalization. We will catch up. We are in an unfortunate part of the world. And all these people who are fighting to create their own independent states, what is the end result? They're queuing to join the European Union. So in reality, they are just a few steps behind. The reality of the world is the globalization. So their conclusion is, well, Greece is a happy place. We are part of the European Union. They're behind us. They will slowly catch up. And we have to make sure that we accept the sacrifices so that we can stay in the European Union and stay with the future. Plus, the idea that when you move in that direction, when you accept the sacrifices so that you're part of the modern trend, that means that you ensure you have a peaceful future. We won't go back to Balkan wars. We are moving towards a peaceful world. And this is where the whole thing comes unstuck, because in reality, what is happening? In reality, we have the triggering of even worse competitions, of even worse balkanization. Greece, which is part of the European Union, is launching a fearsome competition with Turkey. There's a new arms spending round, huge sums of money, as they are competing. Which state in the region is the more important, the best launching pad in this situation? And that's why we have to be particularly clear on this, on the last aspect of the myths of globalization that Chris was stressing. All the idea that globalization means a peaceful world capitalism is nonsense. The reality is a bloodbath now and a bloodbath in the future unless we fight to overthrow them.
Basically, I don't disagree with what Chris is saying, but the thing that I think he's missing is that globalization isn't simply a description of the world, right? And therefore, we can't combat globalization simply by quoting a lot of clever statistics. What globalization is a set of ideological claims about the world, right? Which are basically the old liberal claims, that capitalism is rational, right? and that capitalist economics conforms to a sort of endemic reason about the world by which we can organize and by which we can improve gradually and progressively. So within globalization, there's the assumption that actually international capital is actually about progress, that we're moving forward. And we've had these clever parodies of Marxism in which the most self-indulgent of these types of globalization theorists have talked about the end of history. You know, liberal economics is actually now the end of history. And the consequence of that is not actually what Chris was talking about in terms of the state no longer being important, but actually the division of economics and politics. So the assumption is, yes, the state's important, but it has a very limited set of purposes. All the state does, essentially, is negotiate with capital. That's its point, that's its purpose, and that's all it can do. And interestingly enough, I think that the book that Chris was quoting from a lot makes this argument, and I'm not being entirely right about that, but essentially that this is what we have to look to the state to do, to negotiate with capital. And this is weak in the left everywhere. This is precisely why Blair is so weak. It's why the IMF is able to go in a whole series of countries that used to at least make some sort of attempt at resistance, from Nicaragua to India, to which were all flawed attempts at resistance, but were to some extent not liberal in the classic sense of the word, and try and restructure those societies. So actually what we're faced with when we argue about globalization is actually those sets of values and ideas about the division of economics and politics, and about the essential rationality of capitalism. And we have to argue that, in fact, globalization and global capital produces massive inequalities, barbarism, and is irrational. And that's the key to fighting it. Thank you.
Chris has given a very good picture of the global, or the internationalization of finance, capital, and production. But what the dominant discourse on globalization always covers up is the fact that globalization is not a uniform process. It is not an even process. And if you look at the statistics on the growth of foreign direct investment in the world over the last couple of decades, you will realize this, that in spite of the massive growth of international trade and internationalization of production, the third world is being marginalized. Over the last 20 years, the amount of investment going to the third world has been continuously falling. In the 80s, it amounted to only 16% of the total direct foreign investment of the multinationals. Of those 16%, 11% went to only 4 countries, only the Asian tigers. The remaining went to the rest of the third world. Africa got only 1%. And of that 1%, 70% went to only 4 African countries. Now, what does this mean? It means that the third world, it means that the less developed countries are being marginalized. The developing countries are being pushed further and further from the international economic activity, in spite of all the hoopla about globalization. And it is precisely this marginalization of the third world which explains why today those international Shylocks, the IMF, the World Bank, are so powerful, they are so influential, they impose such draconian policies like structural adjustment programs in the third world. It is precisely because the countries of the third world are even more dependent today. They're even more dependent today on finance capital, which is not forthcoming anyway. And another thing which is important to note when we talk of globalization is what Marxists have always argued. Marx said capital creates the conditions for its downfall. It creates the conditions for collapse. I'm not saying it is inevitable. Tony told us that there is nothing inevitable about the collapse of capital. But globalization means that if there is a struggle today if there is a struggle today by the European working class, if there is a showdown today between American capital and American working class, its consequences will be worldwide. If there is a collapse today in one of the centers of the industrialized world, the effects will be worldwide. And therefore, globalization means what? It means that the potential for worldwide revolution, the potential for international revolution is even bigger today than at any other time before. Thank you so much.
I'm just a little bit concerned that what Chris seems to be saying is that nothing has changed, and I'll be interested to hear him come back on this. Because it seems to me, although there isn't a fundamental change, there are changes there is an acceleration. For example, from the mid-1980s, when world capitalism eventually emerged from the longest crisis since the 1930s, then there's been a huge change in foreign investment, huge changes in mergers and acquisitions. And you yourself have talked about the fact that what bosses need is new political arrangements to actually suit capitals. And if we don't acknowledge that some changes have taken place, how can we explain things like the single market? How can we explain things like the increased impetus for European integration? What that's about is, in the face of intensified competition, of national capitals actually outgrowing their national boundaries and needing to compete in other areas, needing a new set of arrangements. And a few years ago, in an article that you wrote in the International Socialist Journal, you wrote about a messy half world where you had tensions between national capital, regional capital, and international capital. And I thought, and what I'm afraid of is that, taking on the argument about globalization and the completely pessimistic sort of conclusions, that we're actually throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
There was a report on the export credit guarantee scheme that's run in Britain, which is essentially where the British state says to multinational companies, arms exporters, GEC, Vickers, British Aerospace, look, you arrange exports, or rather we'll arrange exports with other countries, and we'll guarantee those payments. So if the country decides to default on payments, we will actually pay for those goods. And the investigative journalist tried to actually find out how much this was costing, and couldn't, because actually there is no accounting system in British Parliament to actually say how much is actually paid out through this export guarantee scheme. One estimate put the deal with Jordan over a 6-month period at £480 million. In other words, the reality is, what makes me so bloody angry, not only do we find out that the British state was selling arms to Saddam Hussein, not only that, but actually the British taxpayer was actually paying for those arms to Saddam Hussein. And I think just one little example about the fact that often these things are a bit hidden. There's no accountancy procedures to actually find out how much this is costing British taxpayers like me and you. But the reality is that the British state supports, and that the links between the state and multinational capitalism are strong, just as strong as they were in the past, if not stronger, both supporting them financially, providing those markets, and providing a stable and disciplined workforce back in Britain.
In the United States, it's not just the buzzword, you hear it everywhere. Ordinary conversation, people say, because the argument's simple. Because of globalization, I have to give up wages. Otherwise, my job is gone. It's as simple as that. That's the way in which most working class people understand it. Whether they work for General Motors, and I'll come to that in a minute, at $19 an hour, or whether they get the new minimum wage in the United States, which is to be raised from $4.25 an hour to $5.15 an hour. And by the way, the same is true in Britain. Leader comments, Guardian newspaper, 2 days ago, LG Electronics, quote, paraphrase, quote, LG looks forward to investing in South Wales, obviously because of the decline in wages. Since the loss of steel and mining jobs in the region, wages in South Wales are approximately 1/2 of what they are in South Korea, end quote. LG Electronics 2 days ago in The Guardian. In other words, the argument about globalization is a way to regiment, to attack, and to attempt to continue the employer's offensive against the trade unions. There are all kinds of other things going on. That's the central political aim of that argument. All kinds of things has changed. 1970, 64 firms are American in the top 100. 1990, the number is maybe 40. Chris's conclusion flows from that, which is, not that the world is more stable, but there are now more, bigger tigers around the world, combined with their states, which make the thing more and more unstable. Our argument isn't to say, close your eyes, don't do anything, but when General Motors workers in Dayton, Ohio go on strike, 300 of them, the reason they went on strike is that General Motors wanted to take the production of brake pads to a supplier plant to a company by the name of Robert Bosch. Bosch is the supplier. No, they weren't taking them to Germany. They were going in the United States. Except Dayton workers get $19 an hour. Bosch workers get an average of $7 to $13 an hour. That's what the strike was about, within the same country, let alone the example that I mentioned about South Wales. In other words, it's about a pessimistic argument, and it's an argument primarily used by liberals, social democrats, the people who were the leaders of, the so-called leaders of the movement, who say, I'm really sorry, in the face of multinational capital, there's nothing I can do. Now, we just watched a strike that went down in defeat, believe it or not, by one of the few British multinationals left. I'm joking here as a little aside, Tate & Lyle, but people's lives were shattered by it. The union officials, the AFL-CIO, the new head of the AFL-CIO said about the struggle at Staley, what can we do? Tate & Lyle is so big, there's nothing we can do. And I just want to end with a quote by a man whose views I don't really agree with at all, but who looked up in a roundtable discussion that was printed in a magazine just recently. People can ask me about it later, or can forget about it, depending on what they want, in which Robert Reich, former sympathetic writer, workers are having a tough time and so on, now part of the government, says exactly that. What can I do? Clinton promised something. What can I do? International capital. And this guy who heads a think tank says, quote, I have to say, Mr. Reich, I object to you speaking of the economy as if you were a tourist watching a volcano that you can't do anything about. The fact is, we are living in an era of what I call turbocharged capitalism, namely accelerated change, and this era has been brought about by the retreat of the state, deregulation, blah, blah. The economy is not something that just happens, Mr. Reich. It's something that people control. And you, as a member of the Clinton administration, have much more control than the rest of us at that table. That really is what we have to say about the responsibility of those who run the institutions, and also remember the example of the General Motors workers who say we won't have production shifted in the same country at lower wages because at the end of the day, it comes back to haunt us as it does in South Wales.